Hello and a very warm welcome to all of you who've joined us for this live stream today, this conversation on making sense of the climate change with Simon Mundy. Simon, Devanshu and Anirudha are all here. I want to quickly introduce them and welcome them. I'll keep the introduction short because most of you are already familiar with their profiles. So Simon, of course, joins us from Somerset in the UK. Welcome, Simon.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks. Great to have you. Anirudha joins us from Bombay, from his office at BKC. Anirudha, warm welcome to you too.
Thank you, Indrajit, and thanks everyone for joining.
Right. Devanshu is joining us from Delhi. Devanshu has very kindly offered to do the key takeaways at the end of this conversation between Simon and Anirudha. And he's also someone who reckons climate change is something that is very close to his heart. So welcome, Devanshu.
Thanks, Arijit. Thanks for having me on this time.
Great. So before I kind of hand over to Anirudha, a quick word about this conversation. Is climate change really the biggest story of our generation? If you asked me that question maybe 5 years ago, I am not sure what my answer would be. But today, I think it's front and center in mainstream conversations around the world. And perhaps that's the reason why we've had such a great response to today's conversation from all of you who've signed up and registered to join us. There's also another reason. I think as the years have progressed, the conversations around climate change have become more specialized, they've become very data-driven, and it's become very technical too. And that's why Simon's book is very important today, because he's brought storytelling and used storytelling to really bring you a very good understanding of the challenges that face us around the world in dealing with the climate crisis, both opportunities as well as the grave dangers that it poses to humanity as at large. The scale and the scale of his book project is truly staggering because he's visited 26 countries across 6 continents, and today we'll get a chance to listen to his experiences as he talks to Anirudha. So without much ado, we'll dive in, but a couple of words for our audience. As this conversation rolls on, please feel free to key in your questions on the chat box on the live stream on YouTube. Live stream is also being, that chat is also being anchored by my colleague and co-founder, Charles Assisi. He's also, I'm sure, already introduced himself. So dive in. We will go on in this conversation for about 40 minutes or so, and then open it up for the questions, depending on how many questions come in. And then I will invite Devanshu to share his key takeaways. But this, we're all looking forward to this conversation, Simon and Anirudha. So it's all over to you, guys.
Thank you, Indrajit, for that wonderful introduction to the book. And once again, welcome, Simon. I'm really, truly looking forward to this. I think it's in the fitness of things that today is the Earth Day and that we are having this conversation. We couldn't have accidentally but chosen a better day for this. And, I really go back to the time when I used to follow your Facebook posts and you were in Mumbai and you were extensively traveling all over India on your bike, right? And I used to be envious of you then, to be honest. And after reading the book, I'm more envious of you, what you managed to do. So did your stint in India shape your decision to research and write this book in any way? Could you take us through the background of that?
Yeah, certainly. I think, like many journalists, I always wanted to write a book at some point. And, I was always thinking, what is my book going to be about? And it was while I was in India that I had the idea. There's one specific episode during my time in India that I'll come to. But I think more broadly, India set me up for tackling this subject because India is a place where you really see many of the really key angles of the climate struggle in sharp relief. So, for example, the energy requirements, the need for greater energy rollout in India is absolutely enormous. And when you speak to people in the energy industry, it's just mind-blowing the scale of additions that are needed. And of course, what form that takes is going to be very important. I'm sure that's something we can talk about later, because India is saying to wealthy countries, and was saying at COP26, look, we are going to add this energy, we need to do it. And with your assistance at an appropriate level, we can make sure it's green and good for the whole planet. And without that, it will be more difficult. So that was one of the things that struck me. But of course, India is also really in the firing line of some of the worst effects of climate change when it comes to cyclones, when it comes to droughts, when it comes to floods in the mountains. So these things I became very aware of. But I think there was one specific trip that I made while I was in India. It was very shortly after I arrived. So this was in the spring of 2016. And I had been hearing about this very severe drought in an area of Maharashtra called Marathwada. So I got the overnight train to Latur from Bombay and spent a few days there meeting farmers and hearing about their experiences. And this was very early in my stay in the country. And what I saw was shocking. I walked along the beds of reservoirs that were just dry and cracked without a drop of moisture. I saw the skeletons of animals that had died, and I walked through the fields of farmers who had to completely abandon their crop and were really uncertain as to how they would move forward in this livelihood that generations, in most cases of their families, had been dedicated to. So this was stunning and upsetting, and it was something which brought one specific thing, which I tried to bring across in the book, really into perspective, which is the urgency of the climate struggle. I think for a long time, many of us thought about climate change as this long-term, slow-burning thing, as something which, oh my God, in 2050, it'll be like this, or in 2070, it'll be like that, and our grandchildren will face all sorts of problems. And if you're a professional person in a big city, you are relatively insulated in most cases from the impacts. But this, probably more than any other single experience in my life, really opened my eyes to the fact that this is happening now. People are grappling with this in a very, very serious way already. And so that was one particular moment in my time in India, which I think really I didn't have the idea for the book immediately, but I think it sort of sowed the seed in some way.
In some ways, a Eureka moment, probably. But, you visited a lot of interesting places. And when I was kind of trying to think about this conversation, I had difficulty in choosing which episodes, which locations should I discuss. But is there is there a favorite moment for you? And why is that so? Is that something fun and unusual that you did during these travels, which kind of, is there at the back of your mind, which you would like to talk about?
I think perhaps one experience that I would single out as being particularly extraordinary was winter in Mongolia, which is certainly the coldest temperatures I've experienced in my life. We're talking well below minus 20 degrees, sometimes more like minus 30. At times it can reach well below even that. And I went off on a trip from Ulaanbaatar, the capital, way off into the northwest of Mongolia in a Jeep with a couple of fantastic Mongolian guys who were working with me on this. And to be honest, at times it was tremendous fun. We were digging ourselves out of snow drifts. We were seeing camels walking through the snow. But there was a very serious reason for our work, which is something called Zud, D-Z-U-D. This is a Mongolian word that refers to very extreme winter conditions. And Zud has always happened in Mongolia. That there are records of it going back as far as they have records in Mongolia, but they're becoming more frequent and more intense. And this is one of the sort of counterintuitive impacts of climate change that could surprise people. You think global warming and, you don't think immediately of extreme winter conditions. Right. But scientists with increasing confidence are linking it to the accelerating melting of ice in the Arctic. So as that ice melts, it changes the movement of heat energy and moisture in the Northern Hemisphere. And so you get some really unexpected effects. And so the herders that I met, and I spent time with them, I slept in some of their gers, these tents that they live in. Yeah. They still live in much the same way as they did in the days of Genghis Khan. Many hundreds of years ago. Many of them have mobile phones now, and some of them have solar panels which give them a little bit of electricity, but still basically they wear the same clothes, they live in much the same way, herding animals as they always did. But for growing numbers of them, that is becoming impossible, and they're having to move to the cities. So it was a privilege, to be honest, to spend time amid this extraordinary culture and learn about it, because it's not clear to me, having been around for so many hundreds of years, how much longer that unique way of life will last.
Wow, that's amazing. No, I remember that chapter very well, the bitter cold and the drive. Let me dive into a couple of other stories and locations that you have in the book. Across every chapter of the book, you have been able to find very riveting stories of individuals and communities, which bring to life, as Indrajit said, a subject which otherwise get buried in numbers and data and scientific jargon. And you speak about solutions in a common man's language to climate change, right? The different things that you saw. The one which particularly struck me, one of them, and which I found very interesting, was the work that is being done in laboratories of, say, Harvard University to bring mammoths back to life, and then to be brought to distant Siberia. Right? This prospect of mammoths again walking on the planet Earth kind of takes me back to Jurassic Park scenario. So could you, for the benefit of all of us today, speak a bit about that incredible story? What is the thawing of permafrost and the tusk rush? People are making money out of this. And then you have the mammoths probably, which will roam again Earth, or at least the plains of Siberia in maybe 10 years or whatever.
Absolutely. Yeah. So this was actually the very first trip that I made out of the 26 countries that I went to. It was while I was still in India. I used my personal holiday to spend 3 weeks in Siberia. I went to a particular place called Yakutia, which is way up in the northeast of Siberia. So this is really remote, even by Siberian standards. And the reason I went there was because of what's happening with the permafrost. So as I write in the book, permafrost is something which relatively recently has been identified as a major threat to the planet. So we have this enormous area of land which has been frozen solid since the end of the last ice age. And because of rising temperatures, that land is thawing incredibly rapidly. And the emissions from it, according to one estimate, are already equivalent to those from all international air travel, and it's getting worse. The permafrost zone of Russia alone is equivalent to China plus Afghanistan plus Nigeria. And that's the scale we're talking about here. So I wanted to see what it looked like up close. So one of the things that I encountered there was mammoth tusk hunters. I went on a little boat up the Dutta River for about 15 hours, I think. And finally came across this camp where they were illegally searching for mammoth tusks. And so for these men who I met, and they were camped out in the wilderness for months at a time in some cases, because this is not a particularly prosperous community, the communities in these places. But you can make big money from mammoth tusks because China has cracked down on elephant ivory smuggling. So there's a lot of demand for mammoth ivory, and you have these enormous long tusks that end up finally engraved on display in casinos in Macau and posh hotels in Hong Kong. So for some people in Siberia, in fact, somebody actually called this the tusk rush. So for some people in Siberia, it seems great, but the mammoths, so they used to roam all over Siberia, but as you mentioned, they may, according to some, be coming back. So what's going on there? Well, this took me way up to the far northeast of Yakutia. So this is an area that was known for its Soviet-era gulags, right up on the Arctic coast. So, I was there in the summer, so it never ever got dark. and it was a really incredibly remote place. And I went there to see something called Pleistocene Park. So it's openly inspired by Jurassic Park, and the person behind it is this extraordinary man. You can find a photo of him along with many other photos, by the way, on my website, simonmundy.com. So you can see for yourself. You know, he's an extraordinary looking man, always wearing a beret, always chain smoking, always drinking vodka with every meal. But he's also one of the most respected scientists when it comes to studying the biomes in the far north. So Zimov was there during the Soviet era. He was studying the local ecology. And then when the Soviet Union broke up, he was told to move somewhere else, but he didn't want to because he had become obsessed with what he was finding in this area of the Russian Arctic zone. And what he was finding was an extraordinary quantity of ancient animal remains. And he came to the conclusion that far more than people had previously realized, this area, which is now covered in trees, used to be steppe, almost like you imagine the plains of Kenya, for example, you know, roamed by animals. Right. It used to be like that. So he started thinking, you know, and then humans came and hunted them to oblivion, and that was the end of that. And then he also, through his further work, as he stayed there throughout the years that followed, he began to realize the problem that I just described, the fact that the permafrost was thawing more rapidly than people had realized. So he started writing about this. It took time for his warnings to be taken seriously, perhaps because he's quite an eccentric figure. But then he started thinking of a way to address it. And that's where Pleistocene Park comes in.
Sorry, if I may ask something, why is the permafrost thawing, and what is the net result of that you saw around there?
Yeah, so it's simply a matter of rising temperature, especially in the summer. It's the temperature is rising year round, so it gets solidified less well in the winter, and then it's more vulnerable to melt in the summer.
Right.
So it's as simple as that, really. It's just like if you leave a block of ice outside on a hot day. It's the same principle. But you see, in fact, the place where I started the book, the Batagaica megaslump, there are some spectacular manifestations of the permafrost melt. So it's 2 kilometers long. It's deep enough to fit the Sydney Opera House inside it. And I stood inside this enormous hole in the ground, hearing that the earth falling down on every side. But so Zimov's idea is to restore, it's counterintuitive again, because forests are very important and they're wonderful in tropical areas. But in the Arctic, actually, you want grasslands, according to Zimov. They're lighter, they reflect more heat. So you bring back the animals. And where do the mammoths come in? Well, as far as Zimov's concerned, the iconic animal of the earlier Ice Age period, and an animal that would do a lot to destroy the forests and bring back the grassland, would be the mammoth. And there are scientists at Harvard University, seriously respected scientists, who are working on genetically engineering a mammoth using the Asian elephant genome. And they've promised the very first one will go to Zimov at Pleistocene Park.
Wow. Did any of this, what you heard, make you a little uncomfortable as you think about it? And this is just fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, much of it, to be honest, and including among the some of the solutions being developed. So to give you one example, engineered meat. So this is something that we're hearing more and more about, and there are 2 basic strands to that emerging industry. So one of them is plant-based. So you probably have heard of Beyond Meat, Impossible Foods. So Impossible Foods in particular, I focused on in the book. I went to visit them in California and saw the high-tech work that goes into creating something which really tastes to many people just like beef, but it's made entirely from plants. But then in Israel, I visited another company near Tel Aviv, which is pursuing something which is, I think, to many people quite unsettling, but could potentially have a very big positive climate impact. So this company is called Aleph Farms, Aleph being the first letter of the ancient Hebrew alphabet. And their technology is based on work that was actually done in human medicine. So there's a scientist who I visited at her office in Haifa in the north of Israel called Shulamit Levenberg. And she's one of the top scientists in the field of cardiac medicine research. And she figured out a way to grow human heart cells to be used in the treatment of cardiac patients. And then someone said to her, have you thought about doing the same thing with cattle cells to grow steaks? Because that could be a great thing for the climate, because so much of the world's carbon emissions are attributed to beef farming. And she didn't immediately go for it, but eventually she decided to revive that conversation, and the company was set up. So what you have now is this company which is growing steaks in bioreactors from the stem cells of cattle. So on the surface, this could be, if they can bring the costs down and scale it up, this could be a much more efficient way of meeting the world's surging demand for meat without animal cruelty, without massive amounts of deforestation that are currently driven by the beef industry. They have a lot of work to do, especially, one big problem they face is that the growth medium they use has to be taken currently from unborn cow fetuses. So this doesn't really meet the no animal cruelty standard yet, but they insist that this is not inherent to the design. This is something which that they're going to eliminate in due course. So all of this is unsettling to many people, right? I mean, you think of frankenfoods, you think of in Margaret Atwood's fiction, there's something called the chicky knob, which is this sort of chicken that has sort of 20 breasts and no eyes and no legs. When we think in our modern culture about these sorts of things, they're often portrayed in quite dystopian, shocking ways. Right. But the fact is, as I wrote about in the Brazil chapter, beef farming is a big driver of climate change. It's a big driver of methane emissions, of deforestation of the Amazon. So do we need to start thinking about certain unsettling approaches? I think we need to at least be thinking about them and interrogating them.
Yeah, it's unsettling. At the same time, I mean, one wouldn't have thought that there will be places on Earth where you're thinking, there shouldn't be forests, but there should be grasslands.
Yeah, I was really surprised when they explained that to me as well.
Yeah, so clearly there are business opportunities out there, but let me focus on the other side of impact on businesses, right? In India, we have seen PepsiCo, Vedanta, etc., being embroiled in controversies around pollution of groundwater. And this was much before ESG, climate change became buzzwords. I remember in the mid-1990s, Grasim's pulp plant in Maharashtra used to be shut down in every summer because there was a water shortage. They didn't have enough water. Now, clearly, this probably will accelerate these kind of disruptions. Did you, during your travel discussions, come up with the impact on businesses? Did you hear of anything where businesses are getting disrupted? Any examples?
This is a particular angle. I think disruption to businesses of water shortages is not an angle that came up explicitly in the business conversations that I had. I was in the businesses that I focused on, but I should say there are so many things that are hugely important that I wasn't able to include in the book. This is not intended to be a sort of encyclopedia of everything you know about climate change. So there'll have to be a sequel inevitably at some point.
Okay, yeah, I look forward to that one.
But yeah, so the companies that I focused on were companies that are developing potential solutions, as well as companies that are involved in driving some of the problems, which I'm sure we can talk about. So companies involved in the fossil fuel industry, companies involved in the meat industry also. And in my current role, now I've returned to the FT following my book project. That's a big focus now, is looking at how the paradigm for businesses is changing, because there are two sorts of risks for businesses. There are the the physical risks, the immediate physical risks of the sort that you identified. And there are also the risks that they face from this rapidly accelerating shift in the wider landscape as we move towards a low carbon economy. And it's moved with astonishing speed. I think 10 years ago, it was seen as anything to do with climate change was seen as CSR, corporate social responsibility. It was, in the same part of the business that would deal with, building schools and sort of charitable activities. Now it's core business strategy, it's compliance risk. About, I think more than half of European companies now have the phrase net zero appearing in their annual results calls, up from roughly zero just in 2019. So the speed with which that has happened is quite stunning. Yeah.
And now investors are asking questions apart from policy, and therefore everybody's changing to that extent. Yeah. Let me come back to that bit about the meat that you said, lab-grown meat, whether from vegetarian or from the fetuses of cows. Clearly, they're moral and unsettling questions. In this country and maybe elsewhere, people may say that is therefore an inevitable shift to vegetarianism one of the choices? And how do you view that debate?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, personally, I would be surprised to see a really massive increase in the number of vegetarians in the world. I could be proven wrong. But based on, conversations that I've had and things that I've read in various countries, I don't see that happening. But someone who really disagrees with me is Pat Brown, the head of Impossible Foods. So he's someone who is a real, I think he would describe himself as a fanatic. And he is driven, as I say in the book. I've met a lot of startup founders. And typically they're just driven by this real sort of lust for creation. They want to create something special. Pat Brown is the only one I've met who's driven primarily by a hunger for destruction. He wants to destroy the US beef industry. And his fundamental approach, and it's a really interesting angle actually, that I think we don't think about enough, is that he's saying meat is fundamentally inefficient. If you look at the amount of basic foodstuffs that are produced in order to produce a single kilo of meat, most of that energy is being wasted on, the bones of the animal, for example, and all this sort of stuff that can't actually be consumed by humans. So it's a fundamentally inefficient use of resources. So he describes his plant-based meat as meat. And he's saying, we have to stop thinking about meat as dead animal flesh, start thinking about it as just a particular product that has a particular taste that people like. And if we make it from plants, there are endless possibilities. You can do much better than natural meat. You can combine things and you can have a perpetual upgrade cycle, much like mobile phones. So that argument is out there. And I think, although I don't see signs of a huge increase in vegetarianism, I think it would be very helpful if that were the case, especially because we do have a growing global population. And if the demand for meat rises as much as expected in China and other developing countries, then I think we will start to see food supply coming under increasing strain.
Right. Yeah, as you say, that 6 calories of input is required, energy input, to get 1 calorie of beef, right? So that it's inefficient. I didn't know the sun was as inefficient in producing energy, which I learned from your book. But we won't get there. But we should leave something for people to read, right? There was another part of the business which I wanted to speak to you about, which was, again, buzzword now, electric vehicles. And as you write in the book, a single Tesla's battery contains more cobalt than 1,000 iPhones. And while we need innovation for sure, EVs are here to stay. The rush for cobalt and then addiction to other rare earth minerals will have probably somewhere disastrous consequences for governance in many countries. And in Congo, you describe it as pathological consequences. Now, what did you learn during a visit to Congo, which made you say that pathological consequences for governance? And where does the solution lie?
Yeah, so this was another really extraordinary part of my travels, and I ended the book with this chapter because it was an incredibly complicated one where the heroes and the villains of that chapter are not necessarily clear. So there's one place in particular that I focused on in that trip, which is a place called Kasulo. And that's an area of a town called Kolwezi, which is in the southeast of Congo, in the center of the copper and cobalt belt. So cobalt had been a fairly obscure commodity. It wasn't seen as one that was absolutely essential to the modern economy, like others such as copper or iron, until the advent of lithium-ion batteries. And most of the world's cobalt comes from Congo. That's where most of the reserves are and most of the production. And cobalt is a really important ingredient in the majority of lithium-ion batteries that are produced today. And the problem is, Congo is it's a huge country. It's about the size of Western Europe with 90 million people. But it's got almost no paved roads. It's extremely poor because it's been very badly and corruptly governed since the Belgians, ever since the Belgians went in there, and it was the personal property effectively of King Leopold in the late 1800s. Now, when Leopold was running the Congo, it was really the focus of one of the first, what we could really call a modern humanitarian campaign, which was the campaign against the brutality that the Belgians visited upon the Congolese to produce rubber. Why did they want so much rubber? Well, because of cars. The first generation of cars, rubber tires, Congo was a key source of production. And what seems to be happening now is that you're seeing a certain parallel with the new generation of cars, electric cars. Again, Congo is the focus of a big humanitarian outcry. And the reason for this is the conditions in what are called the artisanal mines. So these are sort of informal, basically illegal in most cases, mines that people just dig and go down. And Kasulo, this residential area, was the center of this. And that's why I went there. And it all began one day when a man was digging a pit latrine behind his house. And he hit upon a seam of black cobalt. And he knew very well what it was because this is a mining area. So he then, this is the story that everyone tells you in Kasulo. No one, you hear many different names for who this man was, but this is the story that everyone will tell you. He started digging inside his house because he didn't want his neighbors to see. He wanted to keep all the cobalt for himself. And he would bring out the sacks of cobalt under cover of darkness. But then the secret got out. And then everyone started digging around their house to the point that it started, the whole neighborhood of Kasulo turned into this sort of rabbit warren. Now, when I got there, the government had sort of fenced off a whole area of Kasulo and had put it under the control of a Chinese mining company. But there are still people there mining around their houses. And I discovered one site in particular where there were 6 mine shafts. People were going down there. Some of these mine shafts were 30, 40 feet or more.
Deep.
And I went down one of them. I had to go barefoot, like a sort of Victorian chimney sweep, working my way down. And it was scary, to get down there. I went down with a man called Mangovo, who was in his 40s. I was only down there for 15 minutes, but I knew very well that sometimes these mines just collapse. And so it's pretty scary being down there for 15 minutes, but Mangovo is down there all day, every day. And a major reason, and it's an incredibly tough way for people to earn a living. And especially for a child to earn a living, because one of the big reasons for the outcry about the situation in Congo has been the fact that children have been going down there. And there has been some improvement there. I think standards have risen. And I met some of the children who had been going down there and are now being helped by a fantastic NGO called PACT. But one of the things I just want to highlight on Congo is that obviously child labor is completely unacceptable, and especially such dangerous child labor as that. But we also have to ask the question of why children are going down mines in the first place. Why aren't they in school? Why are their families so poor that this can happen? And this points to larger problems of governance in Congo, with the complicity of big Western and Chinese companies. So this is a structural problem, and I think just putting everything in the hands of big companies, you might eliminate the child labor, but I think we need to think more carefully about using this opportunity to build a new global economy. As we build a new economy that has much lower carbon emissions, and we're having to rethink our approach to everything. What an amazing opportunity to think more broadly about these fundamental questions of justice and equity. And I hope that opportunity is not missed.
Yeah. But are you seeing any of that dialogue? You were there at COP26. Your book got released on the sidelines of, COP26, or just ahead of it. Are you seeing any of this dialogue going around in the world?
Yeah, I think there's a phrase which I highlighted in the book, and it's become more and more prominent over the past year or so, including at COP26, which is climate justice. And I think climate justice, the meaning is almost in the eye of the beholder. There are so many different potential forms of climate justice. And that was really, I'd say, the buzz phrase at COP26. And I do think that one important angle within that is looking at how looking at the supply chains within the clean tech industry. So another example is the concerns about forced labor in Xinjiang. We all know about the terrible allegations, and there's a growing weight of hard evidence about real human rights violations in Xinjiang, which is also an enormous source of materials for the global solar industry. So this is another example of supply chain problems that are being interrogated as part of the climate justice agenda. And then, of course, more broadly, it goes to these fundamental issues, which I alluded to earlier, to do with climate finance for developing countries, as well as just the fundamental injustice of the fact that, as I highlighted in the book, the people who are facing the bitterest impacts of climate change overwhelmingly tend to be people who don't have very significant carbon footprints of their own. And it's the people in the temperate, wealthy countries in Europe and North America, first and foremost, who are overwhelmingly responsible for the emissions, but are facing relatively slight physical impact.
There's a good segue to my next question, actually, where I wanted to speak about the schism between the developed and developing world. When I travel, and I can imagine even among the poorer nations, people like me have a larger carbon footprint, right? But I'm still struck by the amount of wastage of resources and unnecessary consumption that I see around the world. Like, there are hotel rooms where I've woken up early in the morning when it's all dark, but I see, all lights in office blocks being on in, say, downtown San Francisco or Los Angeles or wherever you are, right? Restaurant lights are on. And you travel through airports and you're handed this almost a tissue box, like when you buy a burger or something, or even the portion size is so huge that almost 60%, 70% at times goes waste. Those fries and chicken fries or what have you. And I was reading in somewhere else where Bill Gates writes about that 40% of food in US is wasted. Now that's enormous. And do you believe that we should be paying much more attention to unnecessary consumption? Not reduce standards of living, but just unnecessary consumption and wastage, more recycling, which is really not as sexy as a new innovation or scientific breakthrough. But did this at all come up during your research and travels?
Yeah, I think this is absolutely essential, is just more efficient use of resources, notably more efficient use of energy. Heat energy, for example, that's a big thing in the UK, returning here more recently. You might have heard about these protesters who actually glued themselves to the motorway. They were called Insulate Britain. And what they were campaigning for was very specific. They wanted the government to do more to promote the refitting of homes to have better insulation. so that they needed to use less heat energy, because the amount of energy that is wasted is enormous, and it's difficult because it's sort of invisible. It's not something that, you know, if a government rolls out a new set of solar panels, you know, when I was in Saudi Arabia, I went to, you know, this opening of this enormous new solar park as part of this. It's something, you know, they can stand there with the solar panels and so on. Energy efficiency is perhaps less of an obvious vote winner, but it's incredibly important, and I think it's good to see that there's more conversation happening around there. But as you say, it's not just about energy. I think the amount of wastage of food is, especially in a world where many children are stunted due to malnutrition, it's simply an ethical travesty. And it's a climate problem. When you think about the amount of carbon emissions that are attributed to agriculture, which is very large, as well as the transportation of foodstuffs. So I think this absolutely has to be part of it. I would say at the same time, I'm wary of an excessive focus on what consumers can do. I think consumers absolutely need to do their bit, and I think we should all be thinking about how to waste less and act more responsible as consumers. But I think it's important that we don't lose sight of what we can do as citizens also, to put pressure on governments to take appropriate policy actions. But so one concern I have is that there's been an insufficient focus on that, on what people can do as political actors, as citizens of their countries.
No, yeah. In another couple of minutes, I think we'll take a break. Let me ask a few quick questions before that, and I could go on for hours really on this one. You know, climate change skeptics would say that all dire Malthusian forecasts haven't come true. So again, given the number of solutions that you've spoken about, is it time to renew our faith in science, human endeavor, and ingenuity to find solutions, and the fact that we'll find?
I think we should have huge hope for human ingenuity. You know, that there are many of the most exciting entrepreneurs in their fields are featured in the book. I mean, some of them have been raising enormous amounts of money since the book was published, actually, which has been good to see. So there's a lot happening there. You know, that there are these brilliant people, and there is now increasingly the funding going forward to help them. So there's room for hope, but there is no room for complacency, because people have already been losing their lives. You know, the situation is already very severe. And as the IPCC said in its most recent report, it's almost inevitable that we are going to have temperatures going beyond 1.5 degrees, and almost certainly hitting 2. And on our current trajectory, by the way, we're still heading for more like 3 degrees or more. So we are quite profoundly off track. And so what I would say is that it's absolutely right to say there is a huge amount of inspiring work happening, but that should not be seen as reason to relax and say, let's move on to the next problem.
Okay. So before I hand it over to Indrajit, one last question. How did this project impact you as a person, if I could ask you? I mean, this is like almost a life-changing experience.
It was, I mean, it was an extraordinary time. I was 2 years living out of a suitcase, you know, largely during the COVID pandemic, actually. So that was an unexpected part of the challenge, having to navigate quarantines and endless COVID tests and so on. But I managed to keep going. I was quite fortunate that China, for example, I managed to visit before. In fact, I was there while COVID was breaking out, but it wasn't being publicized. So I guess I was one of the last journalists actually to get into China before they closed their borders.
And
so I had I'm sorry? And
to get out.
And to get out as well. So I had various strokes of luck. So of course, it was an incredible experience. I met hundreds of fascinating people in, over 24 different countries. And I would say, when it comes, so for one thing, it's made me even more firmly convinced that this is just the most extraordinary and important story for any journalist. And one thing that people often ask me is whether it made me more positive or negative, more optimistic or pessimistic. And I think I have to say the answer is both, because it made me desperately aware of the severity of the challenges that people are facing. I would point especially to my experiences in Bangladesh, where I saw the impacts of rising salinity levels and increasing migration to Dhaka, often in very, very bad conditions. The situation in the northeast of Ethiopia, where people are being hit by drought and locust infestation. But at the same time, part of me became much more optimistic because I had not previously been so conscious of what I just mentioned, the extraordinary work that's happening in so many different technical fields. So, the companies featured in the book, everything from cultured meat, which I mentioned, to direct air capture, to fusion power, to synthetic fuels. There's a lot of exciting stuff happening. And I think the more that all of us can really get to grips with both sides of that challenge and really try to understand what needs to be done in response, the better equipped I think our leaders are going to be to address those challenges, because it can't happen without popular support and understanding.
No, thank you very much. And I'm sure many of these solutions will work. I'll hand it over to Indrajit now.
Thank you.
Hopefully there are, I'm sure, some interesting audience questions.
Yeah, there are. This has been a fascinating conversation. So there are some very interesting questions that have come. So Simon, I'll start off with the question from Niranjan Rajadhaksh, our dear friend. He's asking, the other part of climate justice is intergenerational. How do you react to the argument that financial costs of the green transition should be borne by future generations that will be richer than us?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. It's a very important one. And it's one that's been grappled with ever since the Stern report that you might remember about 15 years or so. To what extent what sort of discount rate do we apply to the costs of future generations? One thing I'd say is that we assume that future generations will be richer than us because that's what we've been used to. I don't think that's necessarily something we can take for granted, at least in a very substantial way. I think, through history, there have been times when actually growth has been very slow. So that's one concern I would raise. But the other thing is, I think this comes back to the issue of urgency. I think this is something which was especially prominent in the narrative around the time of the Stern report, when people were saying, that there are going to be these consequences in 50 years' time. But actually, the problem is that with every year, every month that goes by, it's becoming clear that this is happening much more quickly than we had realized. Every climate scientist I've ever spoken to talks about these things that were happening, that have shocked them, that are happening more quickly than realized. So actually, we ourselves, we're already facing the costs in various ways, and those costs actually could start to rise, easily within the lifetime of any of us. So it's not just about future generations, actually. I think we're playing a really dangerous game. Some of the feedback mechanisms that I mentioned in the book, we just don't know what will happen with them. The permafrost being perhaps the most vivid example. We don't know how it will behave because we've never tried anything like this before. We've never tried raising the Earth's temperature as rapidly as this. So I think the fundamental, the biggest answer to that is, from whatever point of view, it's just not just about those future generations. It is very, very soon, all of us will face the consequences in a more and more severe way.
Fair point. Meenakshi Menon, the media stalwart and the co-founder of Vanashakti, she asks Simon for your views on the issue of climate refugees. And she's saying that we're beginning to see the big a global crisis, and that India might very well be at the center of it. So given its vast population and clustering around the coast, how do you see this playing out?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think there are many parts of India, of course, being a country which where an enormous proportion of the population is dependent on agriculture, and the disruption that many of those people will face will be severe. It's something that I got particularly I was particularly shocked by in Bangladesh. So in Bangladesh, people often talk about the prospect of the country going largely underwater. And it is true that parts of the country will be submerged. But what's happening already is this intrusion of salinity, not only by rising sea levels, but that's increasingly the dominant factor. And so it's transforming the economy. You're seeing areas that had been reliant on rice farming now being driven by shrimp farming, which can be lucrative, but requires much less labor. So people are flocking to Dhaka in growing increasingly large numbers. And it was really shocking. I think, as far as I can see, the situation in Dhaka in terms of climate refugees is more extreme than in any Indian city in terms of climate refugees specifically. But I think it's something that absolutely Indian city authorities should be thinking about. And by the way, it's not only about the challenges faced within developing countries. Developed countries also, one of the points I made in the afterword to the book, because the book is not, it's a bit different from many other climate change books, and it's not really about my opinions. It's about the stories of the people that I met. But I did have a short afterword in which I gave some of my personal thoughts. And one of the things that I raised as a sort of warning to people in developed countries who are not taking this sufficiently seriously is what happens to politics in Europe, in North America, when you have this enormous wave of climate refugees. So let's look at the Syrian war, for example, which, by the way, followed the worst droughts in Syrian history. Enormous numbers of refugees heading for Europe. The far right were terrifically strengthened by that. You had fascist politicians who were really capitalizing on concerns about this wave of migration. So if you're a fascist politician in Europe, you're probably going to be quite excited about the long-term prospects of big climate migration, because it will potentially strengthen your hand. So these are things that I think, the bottom line is it's going to be a big issue for developing countries. Most of the migration will be internal, but it will be an issue for pretty much every country in the world, actually. Got
it. Thank you for that. There's a question from Luis Miranda. Again, he's a veteran in these parts. He's asked you, what are your views on carbon credits and other market-based solutions to save places like the Amazon from deforestation?
Yeah, and this is a really important question. So it's something that I look at in the book. Particularly, I mentioned direct air capture. So there's a company called Climeworks, which is one of these companies that just raised a very large amount of money. Founded by these two young German engineers based in Switzerland. They've got a project in Iceland, a joint venture with an Icelandic startup, where basically they suck carbon dioxide from the air using machines, and they pump it, they dissolve it in water, pump it underground, and it turns into limestone. So it's locked away. And this is pretty exciting, many would say. It's, once you're sort of reversing the whole carbon cycle. Instead of taking coal and burning it, you're taking a gas and turning it into underground solid. But the thing is that the demand for their carbon, so they're already selling carbon credits. The demand for it will probably be quite limited as long as there's this enormous price differential. So the Climeworks carbon credits cost about 600 euros a ton in terms of, $600 a ton. That's their cost. And then they add more on top of that. So it's about $1,000 and they sell them for. You can buy, as you might have noticed, if you're booking a flight, you can often offset your flights for the equivalent of, $1 or $2 per ton. Why? Because most of the carbon credit market at the moment is driven by offsets that are linked to the avoidance of deforestation. So what does that mean? It just means there is somebody who owns a section of forest who says, I will protect this again. I commit to protecting this against destruction. And if I didn't do that, it would probably burn down. So I will sell you this credit and you give me money and everyone's a winner. But how can you really be sure that forest, that area of forest would really have burned down? If you read my chapter on the Amazon, where I spent several weeks traveling through the Brazilian Amazon, meeting people who were just, very happily burning down sections of rainforest to clear space for cattle pasture, happy to be photographed and videoed and share their names, because this total sense of impunity has set in. If you just protect a particular area of that section of the Brazilian Amazon, these guys will just go to the next bit and burn that down instead. So it is not having the effect that's claimed. So I have a lot of concerns about this, actually, because you already have some big companies out there, one which I wrote about for the FT last year, EY, said it was carbon negative, but it did so just by buying perhaps $4 million worth of carbon credits, probably something of that order, for a $40 billion turnover company. So if you have companies that are doing that, just taking this sort of too good to be true approach, saying, we are now carbon neutral because we've bought a whole bunch of cheap offsets. It's an unregulated market. If that becomes the accepted best practice, then you can end up with a situation where all these companies are net zero on paper because they're relying upon these credits that don't achieve what they say. They're net zero on paper, but in practice, the planet continues to heat up.
Got it. Thank you for that.
So just to be clear, I think we do need offsets. We need negative emissions, but we need ones that actually are properly regulated, properly assessed, and achieve what they claim.
Right. I'll come to Devanshu in just a minute or so. I just wanted to fit in one last question, and we'll keep it very short and tight. This is from Rakesh Bhutoria, Simon. He's asking, are there any salient examples of effective circular economy systems that you've come across in your research?
Yeah, well, I think the circular economy, so one part of this has to be about recycling. I think one angle on that in the book that I would highlight, because it's really interesting to me, it was one of the places that I was most curious to visit, was Saudi Arabia. So circular economy is a real buzzword in Saudi Arabia, because they do still have an economy that's fundamentally driven by fossil fuels. So Saudi Arabia's interpretation of the circular economy is all about continuing to burn fossil fuels, but with carbon capture and storage and this sort of thing. So this, for me, is problematic. I think if you look at what's called blue hydrogen, for example, the problem is, so that's hydrogen that's made with natural gas where you capture the carbon. The problem is that the methane leakage associated with that is a big issue. But a couple of companies that I wrote about that I found to be more promising were one called Sunfire and one called LanzaTech, which you can read about in the book. They're both basically developing alternative aviation fuel, one from carbon dioxide taken from the air, and one from municipal waste. So both of those look to me like quite promising avenues, because fundamentally we're not going to have planes running on batteries anytime soon. So I think, bottom line, the circular economy is something we absolutely need to be pursuing. I think, to the extent that we're still going to have carbon emissions, the extent to which we can capture them and use them for useful purposes is a positive thing. But we have to be careful to make sure it doesn't become some sort of cover that people can use to continue with business as usual.
Right. I know we're kind of very close to 8:30, and we had committed that we'll wrap this up by that time. I will now invite Devanshu to share his key takeaways so that it gives us some scope to reflect and share, walk away with some insights that have emerged, which are important. Since this conversation's been quite riveting, Simon, I was just wondering if it's possible to continue for a few more minutes after 8:30 for those who want to stay on. For those who, are you kind of, do you have any?
I'm going to have to jump on to another call a bit after that, but a couple more questions should be okay.
Sure. So we'll just finish first with Devanshu's wrap up and then take a few more questions and then let you go, right? And for the audience, if you do want to hang on after 8:30, please do so. If you have other commitments, please feel free to move on. There's absolutely no issue. Devanshu, over to you.
Great. Thanks, IG. Just a quick personal anecdote. 35 years ago, I was in a debate which was around the motion that humans are destroying the biosphere. And I was arguing against the motion. That's not to say that we're not doing damage, but my point was that life exists in more ways than we can ever imagine. So we might be doing ourselves out of the world. We might be doing a lot of species out of this world. Life will continue, but in conditions that we will never recognize, in which we would not live. And I think in the last 35, 40 years, the whole thing about climate change, which was on the periphery, as Simon mentioned, has really become up close and absolutely center for a lot of people. And yet, I think there's so much to be done. Climate change, the term, has a very gentle feel to it. And I think Simon alluded to that as well, that it will happen over a period of time. It lacks that urgency. And I think we're right. I think the book is titled Climate Crisis, The Race for Tomorrow, actually. And it does have climate crisis in the subtitle. And I think that's the right term to use to focus on what we can do today. We're losing vast tracts of forests. We're losing vast tracts of drinkable water, potable water, which we need. Barely 1% of water available on the surface of this planet is actually usable by human beings. We have violent weather fluctuations. We have crop failures of all kinds, not to forget the fact that we are actually overfarming even seafood sources. And yet, I think in all of the conversation, one of the things that still stands out is that there is some hope. There is some scope for hope in ingenuity, on innovation, and it could happen in more ways than we can imagine at this point of time. The change that I see personally, and this is again a personal view, I think the change does lie with us. I would slightly disagree with Simon in that we should be focusing on our lifestyle as well. We've taken the past 50 years to be normal, and they're not, whether it is in terms of diet, whether it is in terms of the amount we consume, in terms of fashion, in terms of household products, in terms of the energy that we consume per household. And I think we just come to take that as a norm. And that's something which has to change. We have to look at our own history. We don't have to go very far back, maybe 50, 60, 70 years ago. The world was a very different place. And I think we can actually derive some solutions from that in terms of just making sure that our lifestyle shifts. And that can actually create an impact in a cumulative way because it tips the market. And I think that's a very important economic factor in making companies change and in making governments change. And I think as citizens, as Simon said, we can put pressure on the government, companies, if we have on our own part done our bit actually to change or to shift the consumption that we do. One last final personal point I think that I'd like to add in the sum up is that I think we need to recruit the young. It's their world that we are kind of holding in our hands right now and destroying while we speak. I think we can start the change with the young in schools. We already have some very young leaders on global platforms taking the message out, and I think we can actually amplify that as much as we can, because that's where the change is actually going to come from. We find schools to be, and again, personal experience, we find that schools can actually change families' behavior. Children are actually quite big bullies at home as well. So I think if we can use that as a vehicle for change, I think we'll be on the right track. So Simon, thanks so much for the riveting conversation. Anirudha, great anchoring, and Interjit, thank you for inviting me to sum up.
A pleasure. Thanks. We'll continue for a few minutes. I know Simon has to leave by about 8:40. So we have a couple of questions, and Anirudha might have a few left over from his things which we'd like to fit in. So for those who are leaving, thank you very much, and do share your feedback on the chat in terms of how this conversation's landed with you, and we'd hopefully welcome you back for our future conversations. For those who are staying on, there's a question, a couple of questions. One that's come in from Minakshi again, which is about the change that climate change might bring about in the way agriculture functions. And she's saying that will the factory farm model die out in the next decade? Simon, would you agree?
I think not in the next decade. And I think, there could be grounds to see, expansion of that approach to farming in some quarters. There are places in the world where smallholder farmers are finding it increasingly difficult to continue. At the same time, I think one of the really interesting conversations for me about the future of agriculture is the extent to which we're willing to use technology to change the genetic structure of the crops that we grow. So that's one that was a big focus of my India chapter. And it's an uncomfortable debate. So I featured this conflict between these two very interesting women. So one of them is Vandana Shiva, who, as I'm sure you know, is very, very prominent in the global movement against genetically modified crops. And on the other side of the debate, I featured Usha Zer, who is an executive at Mahiko. She runs their technology, that side of their business. And her work is all about developing new sorts of crops that will be more resilient to the changing climate. And as far as she's concerned, this is just a continuation of work that's been happening forever. As you might know, grains in the wild, the grains like corn and wheat, were originally far smaller than the ones we grow today, but they were bred by very early generations of farmers since at the beginning of agriculture 10,000 years ago. So as far as she's concerned, we've always been playing around with the genetics of the food that we grow, and this would just be doing so in a more controlled way. But there are many people, such as Vandana Shiva, who argue that this is playing God. This could be dangerous, although there's never been any evidence that has been accepted by bodies such as the World Health Organization for that. So it's a very contested territory. And if you look at other parts of the world, Europe, for example, has been very, very reluctant to wave through genetically modified crops. And that in turn has knock-on effects for places like Africa, where governments don't allow genetically modified crops because they don't want to threaten their access to the European market. That is going to be an increasingly contested area. And again, it comes down to how far we're willing to engage with these very uncomfortable angles and these uncomfortable approaches in facing what is this absolutely unprecedented challenge.
Right. I know we could have continued for another hour given the questions and the fascinating conversation that we've just had, but I'm afraid we'll have to let Simon go now. I'd really like to thank you, Simon. It's been a riveting conversation, amazing stories, and the power of storytelling really lies at the center of it, because it brings the whole climate crisis up close and personal, and gives us a much better understanding as this conversation had promised. Thank you, Anirudha and Devanshu, for your participation. And Anirudha, you have something to add?
No, one last sentence. First of all, thank
Yeah.
you, Simon. It was really a pleasure, and thank you, Founding Phil, for the platform. I just want to add one quick point. While WHO doesn't have any evidence against GM foods, and Europe does what it does, what we now have evidence is why we should let science and markets function. Sri Lanka banned fertilizer imports, and we know what's going through out there in food. And one of the persons you mentioned was a cheerleader to that decision and wanted India to follow suit as well. But we will have conflicting evidence, but probably science and markets, we should renew our faith in them. Thank you once again, Simon. This has been just great. Absolutely great.
So thank you for the audience as well for all the questions and for staying engaged through this conversation. We will shortly, I think, send out the recording as well as a set of key takeaways from this conversation. So it should hit your inboxes. And we're hoping that you'd join some of our conversations that are planned next month. Again, we'll let you know. But thank you and to all of you for being part of this wonderful conversation. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thanks, and have a great weekend, everyone.
Yes. Thank you. I think that the recording has ended. Thank you, Simon, for making time for this.
Thanks.